The doctor had already turned away when the desperate man dropped to his knees on the cold hospital floor and begged him to save his mother. His hands were trembling, his shoes were soaked from the rain, and the last few dollars in his pocket were nowhere near enough to pay for the emergency treatment. Then, just as the doctor was about to walk inside, a black luxury car stopped at the hospital entrance. The rear door opened, and a billionaire stepped out. What happened next changed 3 lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance when the world has already given up on them, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories about compassion, courage, and the goodness that still exists in the world. It was a cold Tuesday evening in Cleveland, Ohio, when 30-year-old Caleb Morgan rushed through the emergency entrance of Mercy Heights Hospital, carrying his 64-year-old mother, Ruth, in his arms. Ruth was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow, and every few seconds her head fell against her son's shoulder. Caleb had been working 2 jobs for months just to keep food on their small kitchen table, but when his mother collapsed at home, none of that mattered anymore. He had called an ambulance, but the paramedics told him they were delayed because of another emergency. So Caleb had carried his mother nearly 2 blocks through the rain before a passing driver finally stopped and took them to the hospital. Inside the emergency department, doctors immediately placed Ruth on a stretcher. Caleb stood beside her, drenched and terrified, watching nurses move quickly around the room. One doctor finally explained that Ruth needed urgent treatment and several tests. Caleb nodded desperately and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn wallet containing a few crumpled bills and a nearly empty debit card. He had already missed rent that month, and the electricity at home was scheduled to be shut off. His mother had spent years refusing medical care because she knew her son could barely afford groceries. Now Caleb realized that the one thing she had feared most was happening. When the hospital administrator asked about insurance and payment information, Caleb admitted that his mother's coverage had recently lapsed. He promised he would work, borrow, sell everything he owned, or repay every dollar. But he needed them to start treatment first. The administrator explained that the hospital could begin emergency stabilization, but the specialized procedure Ruth needed would require financial approval. Caleb's face went pale. He looked through the glass toward his mother and felt completely helpless. He ran into the hallway and approached Dr. Nathaniel Brooks, a respected physician who had just finished reviewing Ruth's test results. Caleb grabbed his hands and begged him not to let his mother die because they were poor. He promised that he would repay the hospital someday. He even offered to sign anything they placed in front of him. His voice broke as he explained that Ruth was the only family he had left. Dr. Brooks looked deeply uncomfortable. He told Caleb that he understood, but there were hospital procedures he could not personally override. Caleb's knees gave way. He lowered himself onto the floor, tears mixing with the rainwater still dripping from his hair, and begged the doctor one more time. He didn't care who saw him. His pride had disappeared completely. All he wanted was another morning with his mother. Then a black Mercedes pulled up outside the emergency entrance. A tall man in his early 60s stepped out wearing a dark wool coat. His name was Jonathan Whitmore, one of Ohio's wealthiest businessmen. He had built a national manufacturing company from a small garage operation and was known publicly as a billionaire philanthropist. Yet that evening, he wasn't arriving for a hospital board meeting or a charity gala. He had come because his driver had accidentally taken a wrong turn during the rainstorm. Jonathan walked toward the entrance just as he saw Caleb kneeling on the floor. For several seconds, he simply watched. Then he heard Caleb say that he would give anything to keep his mother alive. Jonathan froze. The words struck him because they sounded painfully familiar. 35 years earlier, Jonathan had been a struggling young man with an ill mother of his own. He remembered standing outside a small clinic with only $7 in his pocket. He remembered begging a doctor for help. He remembered being told that his mother needed treatment he could not afford. But he also remembered one stranger who had quietly paid the bill. That stranger had been a businessman named Samuel Whitmore, who had no idea that his small act of kindness would change Jonathan's entire life. Jonathan walked toward Caleb and asked what was happening. Caleb explained everything through tears. Jonathan listened without interrupting. Then he looked toward the emergency room and asked about Ruth's condition. Dr. Brooks explained that Ruth had a serious cardiac problem and needed immediate intervention. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He told the hospital to proceed with whatever treatment was necessary and that his foundation would cover the expenses. Caleb stared at him as if he hadn't understood. Jonathan simply told him that nobody should have to watch someone they loved die because they were poor. Within minutes, the hospital team began preparing Ruth for treatment. But Jonathan didn't leave. He sat beside Caleb in the waiting room. The billionaire and the broke laborer sat together beneath harsh hospital lights, separated by wealth, status, and an entire lifetime of circumstances, yet united by the same fear. Caleb eventually asked Jonathan why he had helped him. Jonathan looked down at his hands and told him about his own mother. He explained that when he was 27, he had been broke and desperate. A stranger had saved his mother's life when Jonathan had nothing to offer in return. That act of kindness had become the foundation of everything he later built. Jonathan said he had spent decades trying to repay that kindness, but he had never been able to find the man who helped him. That night, he realized perhaps he had finally found another way to honor him. Hours passed. Finally, Dr. Brooks walked into the waiting room. Ruth had survived the procedure. Caleb covered his face with both hands and cried. Jonathan quietly placed a hand on his shoulder. When Caleb entered his mother's room, Ruth slowly opened her eyes. She looked at her son, then at Jonathan standing behind him, and weakly smiled. She didn't know who the billionaire was. She didn't know how much money he had. She simply reached for his hand and thanked him for helping her son. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. He told her that she didn't know him anything. Months later, Ruth recovered enough to return home. Caleb found steadier work through a company connected to Jonathan's foundation, but Jonathan made sure it wasn't charity. Caleb earned his position through hard work and eventually became a supervisor. Then something unexpected happened. Caleb began volunteering at the same hospital where his mother had nearly died. Every Saturday, he helped elderly patients who had no family nearby. He carried bags, helped them find apartments, brought them meals, and sometimes simply sat beside them when they were frightened. One afternoon, a nurse asked him why he kept coming back. Caleb smiled and said that once, when he had nothing, somebody had reminded him that a person's worth was never measured by the money in their wallet. Years passed. Jonathan eventually found the family of the stranger who had once saved his mother. He discovered that Samuel had died years earlier, but his children were still alive. Jonathan visited them and told them the entire story. He explained that their father's kindness had indirectly helped save hundreds of people because it had inspired him to create a foundation that funded medical care for families who could not afford it. And somewhere in Cleveland, Ruth lived quietly with her son, unaware that the simple kindness of one stranger decades earlier had traveled through time and reached her. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with flashing lights or grand announcements. Sometimes they arrive through one person who chooses to care when nobody else does. And sometimes the person who saves you isn't just saving your life. They're giving you the chance to save someone else. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe so we can continue spreading stories that remind us that compassion still matters. And before the story ends, I have one special request. Comment, kindness comes back, if you believe that one good deed can change a life. Because Caleb learned something that night that money could never teach him. When you help someone in their darkest moment, you may never know how far that kindness will travel. Ruth survived. Caleb found hope. And Jonathan finally understood that the best way to repay a kindness from the past wasn't to find the person who owed him nothing. It was to become the kind of person who could give that same kindness to someone else. Sometimes, a miracle is simply a human being deciding not to walk away.